Hello again, welcome back to the Torah Sisters Retreat videos. These are a series of videos that I recorded from the retreat that I hosted here in Michigan back in May, and I'm making them all available for you here on YouTube for free. I hope that you will use them as a way to have your own little ladies event, because now you don't have to come up with the talks. We have that done for you. You just have to push play. And to make it even easier for you to host your own little ladies event, I have a free kit. The links to everything is down below. Down below, click and download this. It will help you watch the videos in order. It will give you all the worship songs that we sang, links, information about the speakers. Like if you want to know more about Rachel, who you're going to hear from, you can read more about Rachel in here. Also, if you've never heard of me, I have a website called TorahSisters.com, and I have a lot of free stuff and blogs and podcasts and stuff. The best thing that I have is the magazine, Torah Sisters magazine. This is from Passover time, and it's a print magazine that I will mail to your home. This is the current issue. I will mail this to your home every other month, and it will bless you. If you, like Rachel, who you are about to hear from, writes a lot of articles in this magazine. In fact, the presentation you're about to hear from her will be in one of the magazines in written form, so a short version of it. So these are the same ladies who write a lot of the articles in the magazine. So if you love these ladies and what they say, you're gonna love the magazine, if that makes sense. Links to everything are below. So this session is one of the workshops. You're going to hear from my friend Rachel Henderson, and she is going to talk to you about 10 ways to ruin Torah for your friends and family. So it might not be what you expect, but I know that you'll be challenged, and I know that you will love Rachel. So thank you, sisters. Bye.
Today is going to be about stories, probably, hopefully, very relatable stories. And so I'm going to tell you a little bit about the church that we sort of came from in order for you to understand. So Alex and I both grew up in a church that actually kept, I would say, most of Torah. We affectionately call them the 13 Commandment Church. So they kept the 10, including the Sabbath, so that's what we grew up doing. They kept the feast, and so we would keep the feast every year. We ate clean, and of course you gotta have tithing. So that was kind of our background. And so the biggest difference, I would say, from where we grew up to where we are now has a lot to do with identity. So the whole element of being, grafted into the Commonwealth of Israel was all brand new to us. And even though we had been doing a lot of the things that we're still doing and that you guys are all doing, it turns out that the why is actually just as important as what you're actually doing. So we didn't come out of a typical Sunday church like probably many of you did. We had a similar coming out experience. And so I'm going to share some of that with you. We learned some things, hopefully, along the way. And I'd like to offer some of those to you today. And here's why. So I think that it's not just important that we keep Torah. I think it's really important that we keep it in such a way that it invites other people, our family, first of all, hopefully our friends, second of all, to do it also. And I'm convinced that people really only embrace practices not just that they believe in, but that they deeply love and desire. And so today we're going to talk about how we go about helping people to love the things of Yah and to want to do those things. And I think that has a lot to do with us. So that's what we're going to talk about. And as I mentioned earlier, I'm much more typically a writer than a speaker. So you'll have to give me some grace. And we'll see at the end of all this how well those two skill sets translate. So I can't do any kind of a talk without discussing books. So I brought a couple with me. And any good idea I have comes from books. And so I'm going to pick up a couple as I go along. And if you're more interested in that particular topic, these are good recommendations for you to delve a little deeper. So the first one I'll hold up is actually called The Screwtape Letters. Has anyone read that? It's a pretty common, well-known book. It's by C.S. Lewis. So the interesting thing about that book is that it's written from the adversary's perspective, right? So it's not in the positive where it says do this and do that. It's sort of interesting for the reader in that way. And so I framed today's talk, 10 ways to ruin Torah for your friends and family, in much the same way. And there's a reason I did that, and I'll tell you in just a minute. But this is a more modern book. This book is called 10 Ways to Destroy the Imagination of Your Child by Anthony Esolen. Really great book. I'm a homeschooling mom, so it's extra relevant to me these days, but it's really great for anyone to read. And so you can see the title of my talk today was very much inspired by the title of that book. And I didn't just phrase these in this way because I like to pretend that I'm sort of like C.S. Lewis, although that would be great. I did it because it's humbling, you'll see as we go through, that we don't set out to do any of these things that I'm going to talk about. But oftentimes, it's exactly what we end up doing, okay? So it's humbling and hopefully a little humorous as we go along, and maybe laying out these principles this way will help us avoid just that. So here we go. There's going to be 10 points. So number 1, tell everyone how wrong they are as quickly as possible. Expect excitement. So you remember being here, right? In the beginning. I know we weren't the only ones. We were a full 3 months into this Torah thing, but we were all in. Experts, really. I mean, if you asked us at the time. And we fully expected that every family member that we shared this news with would share our excitement, right? Anyone else ever feel that way? Yeah, okay. All right. So imagine that we're about 7 years ago. That's when we kind of first came, quote, into Torah, I would say. And we're regular attendees at church. We had been studying quietly on our own and had kind of gone away from the church's opinion on several things, but we could keep that private. So the first thing that we couldn't was when we felt the conviction to start wearing tzitzit. Okay, so Alex, my husband, is speaking and song leading and doing all of these things up here at the pulpit. I'm writing for them, and we ran a teen speech club together. So we knew we were going to have to tell people that this is what we were going to do. And this is completely foreign, mind you, even in our somewhat Torah-keeping church. No Hebrew, anything. So we were going to stick out. So it was not unusual at this time for us to have family dinners at my aunt's house every once in a while, usually on Friday night to bring in Shabbat. And my whole family is in this same church, right? So we decide that we're going to rip the Band-Aid off, and we're just going to get it done. Tell all of my family at this family dinner. And this is what I remember. I remember it's like a 40-minute drive to my aunt's, and Alex and I are sitting in the front seat. We got a couple of kids in the back, and we're strategizing, right? We're nervously but excitedly all right, you open with this, and then I'll say this, and then when they ask us this, I'll come in with this scripture, but oh wait, save that scripture until later, because that's a really good one, right? And so we do this, and we're we're nervous, but we're excited. We're gonna take it on. So the moment comes, we get the words out, right? We're gonna feel convicted. We're gonna start wearing these tassels. And if any of you have had any of these conversations, you know what happened, right? It was just silence. Not curious, no curious questions, no just awkward silence. So we swallowed hard and said, well, if you ever have any questions about why we might feel convicted to wear these, let us know. And we all shoved dessert in as quickly as possible and moved on, right? No one wanted to talk about any of it. So here's the point, and here's what you can write down. For each of these, I'm going to give you the point, and then I'm going to give you some takeaways that are more on the practical end. Here's my takeaway for this. Knowledge cannot be synthesized until it is an answer to a question that they already asked. Okay? They have to ask the question in order to want the answer. You did too. And you probably were uninterested in any of this Torah stuff until you had the questions. So let that be, and trust in Yah's perfect timing. And in the meantime, mostly, close your mouth and live it out. Point number 2. When you get the chance to share Torah, speak as quickly as you can with no room to breathe or be interrupted. Think fire hose. All right, so it took about 5 years from that tassel story that I just told you that until any of our family members asked a genuine question about Torah. It's a long time, 5 years of awkwardness and like you're doing it and they know you're doing it, but they don't want to ask you anything about you doing it. So do you know what that burning question was finally after 5 years? Was it tzitzit, like why? Why are you wearing them? Or maybe it was, why are you doing the Passover on that night and not this night, or this way and not that way? Or it had to be the mezuzah, right? That's like honor. No, it went like this. We don't really know what's changed in your family in the past couple years, but we've watched you blossom. And you and Alex feel, it seems like you're more connected. And your whole family, you just seem more content. And we'd like to know more about that. Right? What a great lead-in to have a Torah discussion. No one here is really surprised by that was the question, right? Because the most likely entrance into Torah is you. It's how you're living and loving other people. Now we know that a huge part of that has to do with his instructions, right? But others haven't made that connection yet. And so most of the time, this is when we get to connect the dots for them. A loving Father gave us life-giving instructions. It leads to abundance and an outpouring of love for other people. All right. So here's some takeaways. First one, ask questions. When you finally get the moment, right, to share Torah, let them get a feel for you. I think a great way to introduce Torah is to admit it came from questions. It came because things weren't adding up, and so it led to more questions for you. It was a recognition of what we didn't know. And I think that people soften, right? When you admit this place of humility, that's what brought us all into Torah, was saying we don't know the answers. So I would encourage you to start with asking them questions and admitting that you had and you continue to have a lot of questions. All right, and the second takeaway here, don't feed people pre-digested answers. As we already talked about, they need to ask the question. And once they do, our job is not to give them just our pre-digested answers. Our job, I think, is to continue to ask questions, offer guiding, put them in the right direction, gently put forth appetizing ideas for them to chew on. Otherwise, it isn't theirs. There's no shortcut, and each of us have to search it out for ourselves. And it's okay that this is going to take time, right? This is one of those things that it's worth taking the time. And the third takeaway for this point, I'm going to offer you, my husband Alex, for those of you who know him, we're kind of opposites. I'm more introverted. My energy is kind of more like this. Alex is super extroverted, exuberant, enthusiastic, passionate about ideas, and certainly was super, and still is, super passionate about all of this new Torah understanding. So he was eager, right? Like someone had maybe sort of halfway adjacently mentioned a Torah concept, and he was like, did you know? So over time, he's learned and matured a little bit and is realizing he has adopted his own criteria for entering any of these Torah conversations, and I wanted to offer that here to you. First of all, they have to be genuinely asking. And we can all recognize a genuine ask versus one that is not. And then secondly, if they're presenting a direct challenge to Yah or to his instructions, he's all in, right? But otherwise, it's probably not wise. Probably not going to be fruitful. All right, number 3, how to ruin Torah for your family and your friends. Do not allow any feelings of grief for old holidays or practices. We're not robots, we're people. And grieving for lifelong, in some cases, holidays is normal. It's not the same thing as looking back longingly, right? If you have grown children and you're springing this on them, partway through their life, many of you likely had traditions and holidays that involved all of your senses. They marked you, and they marked your children. And we'll talk more about that later, about the power of traditions and how they matter. But it takes time. It takes time for Yah's holy days and his practices to feel exciting and regular and warm and fuzzy again. So this is also true for our extended families, not just children in our homes. And I'll tell you a story about that. So as I mentioned, pre-Torah for us, my whole dad's side of the family was in the same church, right? So that's my grandma and my dad and my aunt and all my cousins and all of their spouses and all of their children, all of us in this church. And it took me about 4 years after we sort of made our exit to realize that our exit meant that my grandma did not get to see her great-grandchildren and her grandchildren every week at Shabbat, right? So every week we would all go, we'd bring our food, we'd do our thing, and I didn't realize, right, that it created a loss for her. So I remember I went over to her house when I realized this, and I put my hand on her knee, and I said, I realized, I'm not saying we shouldn't be where we are, but it created a loss for you. You don't get to see them every week, and I'm sorry for that. I'm glad, I believe I'm where I'm supposed to be, and I'm sorry. Right? Sometimes it can feel like a loss, like you're losing a little bit or you're giving up something to say you're sorry, even though you're right. And even though it didn't change where we kept Shabbat, I know that mattered. It mattered. It helped my relationship with my grandma. It made me make more of an effort on other days of the week. So I'm offering that to you. It's helpful to recognize. Sometimes when our family is giving us a hard time about Torah, it's really just their grief, right? It's their grief reaction to losing time with us. And I think that's a legitimate reason to feel some grief. So here's some takeaways for this point. Remember that it's going to take time to form new loves for you, for your kids, for any family members and friends. And remember to regard some harsh reactions you may get as grief. So empathize with your children and your family. It is a loss for them. And it just means that they love you. So stand where you stand and acknowledge that sometimes that creates a loss for other people. All right, number 4. Don't admit what you don't know. Humility is weakness. When you have a family member or a friend or maybe a coworker coming at you, it feels like you have to have an answer for everything, right? Like if you don't have an answer, it's going to discredit everything that you had already said. This is your friendly reminder that that's just not true. In that moment when you don't know, just admit it. Smile, be vulnerable. Admit that to them that it's your pursuit of understanding. You don't have to have arrived. None of us have arrived. Right? You're just committed to the search for understanding and submitted, hopefully, to whatever that search turns out to be. And this applies to our growing children, too. They're going to have questions, and it can be scary to have all the answers. But here's the thing. I don't think that children leave the faith because they asked their parents a biblical question and their parents didn't know. I think one reason children might leave is because they asked the question. You refuse to admit that maybe you didn't know and didn't say it, right? We're all in this together. It's a learning process, and it's okay. So I think that instead of pretending to know, just be vulnerable and acknowledge that it's the pursuit. It's really the hardness that turns people away. So here's the challenge to those of us in the room related to this point. Just because you think you know more than probably just the average Christian, let's say, commit yourself to listening to others as if they know something that you don't. That's one of these takeaways on here. Because they do. right? Everybody knows something that you don't. And this is we need to not let our Torah knowledge block our ability to listen and to learn. And that's the kind of person that draws people in. Someone who knows much, speaks little, and really wants to learn more. So let's be those kind of people. And this is how we put it in our household. Make friends with what you don't know, not what you do, right? So make friends with that. Recognize that there's a whole world of information out there that you don't know. Make friends with that. Be curious about that. Don't just court what you already know, which is really easy to do when you think you know more. Number 5, blur the lines between preferences and instructions. So lack of clarity is the main challenge, I think, of the first generation of anything. I actually wrote an article for Amy about this. I think I called it Torah Pioneers. So of everybody in the room, just raise your hand if you would consider yourself the first generation in Torah. All right, so basically everybody, right? I would include myself in that, even though we grew up doing some of these things. There's quite the divide, and so it was a rift in my family. So I would consider ourselves in that. It's very hard to have a top-down view when everything is new. And our ability to pass down our faith is directly related to how well we can articulate it. Because the people before us didn't do that, or at least we didn't know that, right? So we need clarity to separate personal preference from God-ordained. And we have to be intellectually honest with the people around us in order for them to begin to trust us, right? My husband always says that we're living in the wild, wild west of the diaspora. And it feels that way, doesn't it? There's no temple. Yeshua's not here straightening us all out, telling us how to do it. So we're all going to do it a little differently. At some point, we have to go from judging those Torah keepers who keep the days a few days earlier or later than we do, to just being really excited that anyone wants to keep the days, right? That's the difference between, I think, a young faith and a more mature faith. And all of us being new, first generation, we're in the young part. We need to kind of graduate ourselves into that more mature faith. And when we're young into Torah, we're passionately parsing out the traditions of men from what is written, and rightly so. There's an important time for that. But, and this also brings back the previous point, we have to be humble enough to admit that our preferences are not the same as Yah's. And also that we might have something wrong. So celebrate when people are wanting to keep his instructions, even if they're doing it a little wonky. Imperfect obedience is all that any of us can offer, right? And if you're a parent, you graciously, willingly, lovingly accept this from your children. So nothing will turn our children who are watching us, or our family and friends who are watching us, nothing will turn them away more than watching us squabble about our preferences. So if someone's trying to keep Torah, be glad. The details will get sorted out later. Point number 6, how to ruin Torah. Don't utilize the preparation day. Make Sabbath a weekly burden. As I mentioned before, we actually did grow up in a Sabbath-keeping church. However, they treated Sabbath much like most people treat Sunday church. So we'd drive on our way to services, we'd pick up our Starbucks, we'd go to church, and then afterwards we'd all go out to eat, right? So it was not until we were sort of in Torah, some of our views changed on that. We decided buying and selling wasn't a great plan on Shabbat. So did you know there are 4 meals you have to prepare in that 24-hour period? I mean, it's like dinner and breakfast and lunch and dinner, and if you have little kids, there's all the snacks and all of that. It was quite the learning curve, even for somebody who kept Sabbath their whole life, to learn how to keep Shabbat. So I have just a few simple, practical tips. If you want to make Shabbat special, it takes work and it takes intention, and that's probably why he gave us the preparation day. So, first of all, simplify where possible. Holy does not mean fancy. Not the same thing. If you're in that season of your life where you can fully set the table and you can make it fancy, go for it. I've been to households like that, and it's very special. If you're not, like when we came in, I had my first 2 children are 14 months apart, and the next one's like 16 months after that. I think I was pregnant with the 3rd one when all of this happened. So I was not in a fancy stage of my life. Okay, so simplify. It doesn't have to be fancy. Second of all, create easy and repeatable distinctions. So when I think about Shabbat, it is supposed to be distinct, set apart, different from the other days. So think of easy and repeatable ways that you can do that. One simple example that we do in our family is we have a different set of dishes. Does it take me any extra energy to pull out one set versus the other? No. But will my kids remember those dishes as the Shabbat dishes? Yes. Number 3, orient your whole week around Shabbat. Okay, so in the Hebrew language, obviously, the days are actually named that way. 6 days from Shabbat, 5 days from Shabbat, 4 days. It's literally a countdown to Shabbat. And that is really how I have begun to live it. If I don't do what I need to do on Monday or Tuesday or Wednesday, then Friday I'm trying to cook and clean and pack the backpacks and do all the things, and it's stressful. And that is not the feeling that I want to have, or that I want to pass on to our children about Shabbat is coming. It should be an exciting feeling. And the only way it can be exciting is if you simplify, you create easy distinctions, and you spend your whole week doing small things to get ready for it. All right, number 7, throw any or all traditions out the window. So this is where it starts to get real. We can all mostly agree, kind of chuckle at the first several points, the overexuberance, the naive oversharing. But if I'm being honest, I think this is one of our biggest battles as Torah keepers. So let me explain what I mean by that. In some true ways, these ideas that we've all grabbed onto are the oldest and most established. But in other more obvious ways, these things are brand new. They're new to us anyways. So when we throw out the church, I think we have to be very careful to not throw the baby out with the bathwater. Throwing out the church also means throwing out any structure, any regularity, any liturgy, and habit. And we are creatures of habit. And our children do need regularity. They need repetition to train their loves and their desires. We run this dangerous risk, in my opinion, of jumping out of organized religion into what I affectionately call disorganized religion. And if you've been in Torah for more than 5 minutes, you know what I mean. There's a lot of confusion and disorganization. So I'd like to take a few moments to reflect on the dangers of disorganized religion. So I'll describe a little bit more that church that we grew up in. If order and chaos are two opposite forces and they were placed on the scale, this church leaned very heavily on order. Okay? Services at 10:30. We had 3 hymns, 1 12-minute sermonette, no more than 3 scriptures in that sermonette, announcements, 1 more hymn, 45-minute sermon, and 1 hymn and a closing prayer with a man in a tie. Right? This is every time. And those of us that have kind of come out of the box can kind of scoff at that kind of structure, right? The Spirit's not in that. There's no room for anything. It's even boring, right? And sometimes it was. And to have a genuine, humble inquiry like we had was met with real resistance. That's what happens when you lean too heavily on order, when it's too rigid, right? But as time has gone on, I've noticed that my pendulum is swinging back towards the middle, right? An experience that any maturing person has when you sober up and you realize it wasn't all bad. Traditions or ways of doing things come about and stay around for very good reasons. And when you enter the blank slate of Torah, with all the many logistics and questions, at first it's exciting. We get to learn it all over, and we're frantically heaving stuff overboard, right? I remember this phase very in detail. And then it's still exciting, but it's daunting. And you begin to realize all the work that went into creating those rhythms and those habits and those liturgies and those things that you just did. You showed up and the services happened. The chairs were set up. The sound system worked, right? And then it becomes humbling. You realize as we're recreating this thing kind of from the ground up, what if we get it wrong, right? Or what if we're too busy proving to others which calendar is right that we forget to form any faith-building traditions? The way I understand it is that habits and loves are like a revolving door, okay? The things that you love form what you repeatedly do, or your habits. And then the things that you do habitually orient you towards what you love. So isn't it important then to be intentional about the spiritual habits that we build into our children's lives? Because no one else is going to do it for us. There's no established church, right? So this is when I will grab this last book here that I'm going to talk about. This book is called You Are What You Love by James K. Smith. So I wouldn't say this about many books, but this book changed my life, I would say. Well worth reading. And the concept from this book that I'm going to share with you right now is that we are not brains on sticks. Ultimately, we are what we love, not just what we know. And a lot of coming into Torah, for most of us, had to do with what we knew, or what we didn't know, and then hopefully we know now, and are continuing to know. So that is part of it. But if we are what we love, not just what we know, then in a big picture sense, we are raising lovers of ideas and things, and not just thinkers. And I think that's why Scripture counsels us, above all else, guard your heart, for everything you do comes from it, right? That's Proverbs 4, I believe. Yeshua's command to follow him is a command to align our loves and our longings with his, and to want what he wants, to hunger and thirst after Yah, and to crave a world where he is all in all. I will not be surprised to find that it is the smell of egg bake and cinnamon rolls on Shabbat morning that ties our children's hearts to Shabbat. Theology comes later, when there's a willing heart. The willing heart, I think, comes largely from the habits that we form, because those habits form what we love. The prayers we pray to celebrate the beginning of Shabbat mark us. It brings to a halt all the thoughts and concerns and pursuits that capture our attention every other day. These are not just things we do, they do things to us. And I'm convinced that we can't only think our way to holiness, sanctification by information transfer, right? That's not how it happens. That's why we have to view learning, discipleship, as training our desires holistically. We're training our desires. We can't not love. The question is, what are we going to love, right? And how do we help our children love the same things? So here's some takeaways for you. We believe that practice makes perfect, that repetition is the key to becoming good at anything except spiritual things. Well, couldn't saying beautiful and true words train our minds and our hearts towards what is good and true as well? Things that we repeatedly do, spiritual habits, spiritual traditions. One example of this are the simple blessings that our Jewish brothers and sisters say as they rise, as they go to sleep, as they eat a meal. They're trying to orient their hearts and their minds in the proper direction. Spiritual habits like this do orient us back towards our Creator. And as we rightly put down false man-made doctrine and ritual, don't forget the power and the meaning of biblical orienting habits. Just because something isn't in Scripture doesn't mean it's wrong, or that it doesn't have value. or that it couldn't help us love him and his ways on deeper levels. We are not brains on sticks. We are converting the whole person, the mind, the soul, and the heart. So I would urge you to consider, allow that pendulum to swing back towards the middle just a bit, and add some meaningful spiritual traditions that will anchor your family in this way of life. All right, point number 8. Make sure that your Sabbath-keeping and fellowship time is as sporadic as possible. Probably preaching to the choir because you're all here gathered for fellowship time. So this point ties very heavily to the previous one, right? One of the spiritual habits we must practice is how to rest well. A cousin of mine gets such a kick out of my recent commitment to not committing. She'll ask me, so are you planning to be at community this Shabbat? And I'll smile and I'll say, that's the plan. And I've always been a planner, and in some ways I still am. But something happened inside of me when we got courageous enough to step outside the church and ideas that we had sort of mindlessly adopted. We shed that man-made insistence on dress codes and ties when you pray and the banning of children at Passover service and all of those things. And that was good, and it's all part of the process. However, again, that pendulum's swinging back, and we're realizing how important regularity is to us and to our children. And it was easy, and it still is, to some extent, to just stay home this Shabbat, right? I'm introverted. I have 4 small children and a very extroverted work-from-home husband. I understand the value of hibernating. But I also see the immense value in participating actively in a community of believers. Turns out that Torah is pretty easy to follow when you're by yourself. True. But the truth is that most of his instructions cannot be properly practiced outside of the camp, right? In fact, an interesting study would be to go in Scripture and see how badly people wanted to stay in the camp. I mean, it was a serious thing to not be in the camp. I take it for granted. I know I do. We can ruin Torah for our families if we frequently forego gathering or scoff or complain about how it's being run. There are times for quiet Shabbats at home to reconnect as a family unit, but I want to impress upon my children the habit of gathering together, not out of guilt, not the finger wagging, thou shalt not forsake the communion. I want them to believe that to miss out on Yah's gathering of his people is to miss out on a blessing, because it is. So do what you can to make your Shabbat gatherings as regular and as expected as possible. And to close this point, I'll leave you with a word picture of how I'd like our children to view regular fellowship. Have you ever been playing with a beach ball and tried to hold it under the water, like in a pool, right? Its tendency, you might even say its desire, is to rise to the surface, right? It's restless when it's held under the surface of the water, and it wants to be floating. And there might be times when that ball can be temporarily held underneath the water, just as there are times to maybe stay home and gather into ourselves, soak in the quiet of home. But mostly, I want our children to bob back up to the surface, to rejoin the fellowship, to recognize that our rightful, Yah-intended place is in the camp, and that our home cannot be a replacement for the congregation. I hope that what they find in gathering is great value, and that there's things to be learned there, and that it's a rejuvenating resting place. So there's your takeaways. You're going to commit to regular and imperfect fellowship. Recognize that our home cannot replace the congregation. And then bob back up to fellowship, just like that beach ball. All right, point number 9. Shove your children aside so you can learn more Torah. These keep getting more real, don't they? I see this point manifesting in two ways, the male way and the female way. So I'll talk about those. The female way, sometimes, especially in the beginning, it felt like there was this whole world of information out there that I didn't know. And the only problem were the 4 small, needy children that seemed to get in the way of me knowing all of this information. I do recognize the irony in that statement, but that's how it felt sometimes. I have every daily opportunity to practice Torah, right? To practice sacrificing my desires to serve my family. But what I really wanted was to listen to that teaching on, was the Last Supper Passover? This is one of those things one of those times that being a farmer's daughter, as I am, it could serve me if I let it. So I'll share it with you. Life is full of seasons. Those seasons come and they go and they come again. The season when we have our children in our homes is short. And we will have many seasons to learn the details that we really want to know. But when our children are young, we have to trust that the Torah that we need to know is the Torah that we can practice. The male way of this goes like this. Let's have a 5-hour service where we midrash Genesis 6. Now, I'm not saying there's no place and time for the nitty-gritty, long-form biblical discussions. There is. Here's my thought, though. If we're doing this for the next generation, that's a great way to lose them. We have to start thinking holistically as whole families. And I fear that sometimes we shove our children aside so we can learn more Torah. I'm guilty of this. In fact, I'm guilty of all of these. I've told you stories on myself on all these. So there's a time for everything and a balance to be found. The service can't always serve the teenagers, but that also means it can't never serve them. We have to be careful that we aren't ignoring the needs of one part of the body so that we can just know more. So here's your takeaway. I put here a list of what I consider a balanced list of spiritual habits that should find regular place during our fellowship time. Eat together, pray together, sing together, and read and learn together. They're each so important. That doesn't mean we have to do all of them every time. I actually consider myself a less is more kind of a person in just about every aspect of my life. As a homeschooler, I found this to be incredibly true. 15 minutes of my child's passionate attention is worth way more than an hour and a half of me droning on. So prioritize engaging in each of these spiritual habits within your community. They each serve different stratas of the body, and they're all important. Don't underestimate the ethos that is formed by sharing a table. Some of those most important conversations, the questions you want your teenagers to ask, they will happen at the table. It's important. Prioritize it just as much as the learning and reading together. And everybody here knows that there are things that can be sung that cannot be said, right? Prayer, it has to be done together. It's what forges us. So hopefully we can build all of these practices in a balanced way. All right, point number 10. When you obey God, it must come from fear or guilt, never gratitude. If you know me at all, then you would know that I'm somewhat obsessed with old things, old ideas, old books, old ways of living. So naturally, whenever I take on a new role, like becoming a wife, or when I became a mom, I would look to the past for advice on how to do these. I wanted character traits. I wanted a list of what can I do to be a good mom? What can I do to be a good wife? Thankfully, it turns out that ancient and classical people were really obsessed with these questions too. How do we live these things well? And the amount of recorded books and discussions on character, on how to become good at whatever we're doing, is plenty. The more I read the Bible, the more I study those books, the more I have come to think that there are really 2 character traits. The first is humility, right posture before God, and the second one is gratitude. another form of right posture before God. A friend asked me one time what makes me cry most often. Now, I'm not a big crier, and many of my female friends kind of give me that like German Shepherd head tilt because of that. So she asked me, Rachel, like, what does make you cry? And having never thought of the question before, I considered it for a moment, and then it came to me. I cry most often when I'm overwhelmed by gratitude. So I'll give you an example, and then I'll explain why this matters to us in our discussion today and begin to wrap up. About 3 years ago, our family found Azure Standard. It's this little family farm in Oregon. They grow a lot of their own food and ship it across the country, and they have other brands that meet their standards as well. So all of you lived through the last 3 years, the craziness, the lockdowns, all of that. So you can imagine how grateful I was to find a food source that didn't have certain, say, entry requirements, right? So I load up all of our children in our van, drive 45 minutes to meet this big semi-truck in an empty parking lot. I joke this is probably the closest I'll ever come to a drug deal. Because that's kind of what it felt like. So we load our boxes into our car, drive the 45 minutes home. Kids all run, get out of the car. We bring in the boxes, and I'm looking at all this food, and I have this immense urge to take everything out, put it in my perfectly labeled jars, and put it away. I'm very organized. And then this thought occurs to me as I'm looking at my counters and the floor and all the food. I'm like, wow, like look at all of this food, like good food that I get to nourish my family with. So I restrained myself from putting everything away, and we started a new tradition. And I called all the kids back in. I asked Alex to come in the kitchen, and I made him look through the boxes. I'm like, look in all these boxes. And I said, we're going to kneel down on our kitchen floor, and we're going to thank him for this abundance. And so we did. And not much gets me, but hearing my 5-year-old thank God for that wedge of Parmesan cheese, it did. And it does every month when we do this. We can't see the future, and we don't know if our children or our family are going to grab hold of this covenant. But I'm pretty confident they're going to remember praying on the kitchen floor, right? And I can do that. I can consistently point our children and our friends and our family towards the source of all good. I can ingrain the habit of thanksgiving. And here's why that matters. From thanksgiving flows the desire to obey. The why of my Torah obedience comes from gratefulness. Of course I obey God because He is God and I'm not. That's the humility piece that we talked about earlier. But daily, during the grind of exhaustion and the pulls at my time and my soul, it's because I'm grateful. I'm grateful that He created me. I'm grateful He helped Alex and I create 4 more people. I'm grateful He wants only blessing for us. And because of that, we have instructions. He created a way, a clear path to walk on that we don't have to reinvent. And those instructions lead to life and abundance and justice and mercy. This is where we want our children's Torah obedience to come from. I'll tell you one more short story and then I'll be done. Early on, I used to use my Facebook, judge me if you will, and I joined a Torah's women's group on Facebook. Again, judge me if you will. So you can guess how well that went. But before things went south in that group, in order to join the group, you had to read a list of principles and agree to them, right? And there was something in there that I read that I won't forget. I'll add my own color, but it went something like this. Most of the world has a bare minimum buy-in. What's the least amount I have to do in order to get in, right? And one of the biggest objections to Torah is it's too hard. It's too ancient, it's too old. There's no way that we can expect modern people to do these things, right? But, and this is the line from the group, it said, here, in this group, we think, after all you've done for me, this is all you require? That's it? Obedience as the natural outgrowth of gratefulness. We can't guarantee the fruit of obedience, but we had better be planting gratefulness. All right, so we're going to recap those 10 ways to ruin Torah that we've discussed. Number 1, tell everyone how wrong they are as quickly as possible. Expect excitement. Number 2, when you get the chance to share Torah, speak as quickly as you can. Think fire hose. Number 3, do not allow any feelings of grief for old holidays. Number 4, don't admit what you don't know. Humility is weakness. Number 5, blur the lines between preferences and instructions. Number 6, don't utilize the preparation day. Make Shabbat a weekly burden. Number 7, throw any and all traditions out the window. Number 8, make sure your Sabbath-keeping is as sporadic as possible. Number 9, shove your children aside so you can learn more Torah. And number 10, when you obey God, make sure it is rooted in fear or guilt, but never gratitude. So there you go, 10 ways to ruin Torah for your family and your friends. Now go and don't do them. Thank you.